Corrupt cops frame black woman, a federal nightmare unfolds in court. It was a chilly night in Charleston, South Carolina, when officers Jake Reynolds and Ryan Carter spotted a sleek black SUV cruising down a dimly lit road. The woman behind the wheel, Maya Brooks, had no idea that she was about to become the target of something much bigger than a routine traffic stop. Flashing red and blue lights filled the night as the officers pulled her over. The moment she rolled down her window, their attitudes shifted. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds ordered, his tone dripping with authority. Maya, calm but wary, asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" Carter smirked. "We'll see about that. You fit the description of a suspect in an ongoing investigation." That was a lie. Within moments, the situation escalated. A bag of white powder, something Maya had never seen before, mysteriously appeared in the back seat of her SUV. Carter's smug grin widened. "Looks like we got ourselves a real problem here," he said, tightening the cuffs around her wrists. But what these officers didn't know, what they never could have imagined, was that Maya Brooks wasn't just another woman. She wasn't some defenseless target they could plant evidence on and throw behind bars. She was a senior CIA operative, deep undercover, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. What followed was a legal battle so intense, it would rip through the entire Charleston PD, exposing corruption, lies, and a conspiracy far bigger than anyone had anticipated. And when the truth came out in court, it destroyed everything these cops thought they could control. The night was calm in Savannah, Georgia. The glow of streetlights flickered above deserted sidewalks, casting long shadows on the quiet roads. A few late-night cars sped past, their headlights briefly illuminating the empty streets before disappearing into the darkness. Avery Carter sat behind the wheel of her midnight blue Range Rover, her fingers lightly gripping the steering wheel as she navigated through the suburban neighborhood. She checked the time, 12:07 a.m. The day had been long, but there was a sense of closure settling in her chest. Her mission in this town was nearly complete. After months of careful infiltration, she had everything she needed to disappear clean, efficient, and unnoticed. As she approached a dimly lit intersection, she slowed, her sharp instincts kicking in. A reflective stop sign caught the faint glow of her headlights. She came to a smooth, complete stop, her hands steady, her mind as sharp as ever. Then she made the left turn. The moment she did, flashing blue and red lights flooded her rearview mirror. A squad car crept closer, its siren splitting the silence of the night. Avery didn't panic, she never did. Years of covert field training had burned those reactions out of her system. Instead, she exhaled slowly, scanning her surroundings, calculating. She flicked her eyes up to the mirror. Two officers, their headlights gleamed against the back of her vehicle. Something was off. A routine traffic stop at this hour, in this specific area. Avery had seen setups before, and she had the sinking feeling this was one of them. With controlled precision, Avery guided her car toward the curb, keeping her movements measured. She flicked on the hazard lights, turned off the engine, and reached for the glove compartment, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of her driver's license and registration. Behind her, the patrol car rolled to a stop, its flashing lights bouncing off the dark pavement. She watched through the side mirror as two officers climbed out, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of the street lamps. The first officer, tall, broad-shouldered and exuding an air of unshakable authority, walked with slow, deliberate steps toward her window. His uniform, crisp and perfectly pressed, bore the name Officer Jake Matthews. His partner, Officer Eric Dawson, shorter but just as stocky, followed close behind, his stance rigid. Both wore the navy blue uniforms of the Savannah Police Department, their badges catching the dim light. Avery's mind cataloged the details instantly. Their movements, their body language, the way they carried themselves. Something wasn't right. "Good evening, ma'am," Matthews said, his voice steady, professional, practiced. He leaned down, shining his flashlight through her window, sweeping the beam across her face, her dashboard, her back seat, searching. Avery remained still, her expression unreadable. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" he asked. She met his gaze, calm, unwavering. "No, officer," she replied, her voice even. "I wasn't speeding, and I made a full stop at the intersection." For a split second, something flickered in Matthew's eyes, a hint of amusement, maybe even satisfaction. The corners of his mouth lifted just slightly. "Actually, you rolled through that stop sign back there," he said, his tone firm but laced with condescension. "That's a moving violation." Avery didn't blink. She had spent years training for situations like this, and she knew without a shadow of a doubt this wasn't about a traffic stop. Avery's brow furrowed slightly, but her posture remained relaxed, controlled. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her voice steady, measured. "If you're mistaken." "License and registration," Matthews interrupted, his tone turning sharp, authoritative. Avery complied without hesitation, her movements slow and deliberate. She had no intention of escalating this unnecessarily. Matthews examined her documents, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the details. His fingers lingered a fraction too long on her driver's license, the muscle in his jaw shifting as he processed the information. "Georgia plates. Savannah address," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, louder. "You live around here?" Avery gave a curt nod. "Yes, officer." Dawson, who had been loitering near the rear of her SUV, suddenly called out, "Hey Matthews, you might want to check this out." Avery's pulse remained steady, but her mind sharpened. Matthews passed her documents back without another word. "Stay in the car," he ordered before striding toward his partner. Avery watched them through the side mirror, her instincts now on high alert. Dawson was pointing at something, his voice low, conspiratorial. Matthews leaned in, nodding. Then, the two men exchanged a glance of silent agreement. A flicker of unease curled in Avery's chest. Not fear, she didn't do fear, but she knew this feeling well. It was the cold, calculated warning of a trap being set. Seconds later, Matthews returned to her window. His posture had changed, his expression now grim, certain, and Avery knew this was about to go south. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Avery tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, controlled. "May I ask why, officer?" Matthews exhaled sharply, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. "We've got reason to believe you're in possession of illegal substances." Avery's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Illegal substances," she repeated, her voice steady. "I think you've made a mistake." Matthews barely reacted. "We'll see about that," he said, stepping back and motioning for her to exit. At the rear of her SUV, Dawson stood waiting, his arms crossed over his chest, smug amusement plastered across his face. Suppressing a sigh, Avery unlatched the door and stepped out, her movements smooth, deliberate like someone with all the time in the world. She stood with her hands at her sides, watching as Dawson theatrically lifted the trunk, his fingers curling around the edge like he was revealing a grand finale. And then, with a mock gasp, he gestured toward a small, unmarked bag, positioned just near the edge of her trunk. Well, Dawson drawled. "What do you know, a bag of powdery goodness?" Avery's eyes flicked from the suspiciously placed bag back to the officer's. Her face remained unreadable. Inside, however, her mind was a machine, working at full speed, cataloging every detail, every inconsistency. The bag hadn't been there when she left her house. She was absolutely certain of that. This was a setup. Matthews stepped closer, the smug smirk on his face widening, as if he'd just won a game she didn't even know she was playing. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Avery met his gaze, and for the first time, a slow, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips. Not fear, not guilt, just the kind of look that said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I'll save my comments for the appropriate setting." Avery's voice was smooth, composed to composed. Matthews chuckled, mistaking her calm for arrogance. "Oh, you'll have your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Dawson stepped forward with his cuffs, expecting resistance. He got none. Avery let it happen, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly. There was something in her voice, a quiet certainty that made Dawson's hand hesitate for just a second before the metal cuffs snapped into place. Matthews scoffed. "Yeah, we'll see," he said, gripping her arm and leading her toward the squad car. "Let's see how confident you are in front of a judge." They thought this was an easy arrest. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The patrol car cruised through the quiet streets of Savannah, its flashing lights reflecting against darkened storefronts. Avery sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression unreadable. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Streetlights flickered through the windows, casting fleeting shadows across her face, but her gaze remained locked on the road ahead. Her mind, however, was moving at full speed. Every moment of the encounter replayed in sharp detail. The stop sign that didn't exist, the forced confidence in Matthew's voice, the smug certainty in Dawson's stance, the planted bag, positioned just right. This wasn't random corruption. It was calculated, rehearsed, a setup, and that meant there was something much bigger lurking beneath the surface. From the driver's seat, Matthew stole a glance at her through the rearview mirror. His lips curled into a faint smirk. "You don't seem too worried," he said, breaking the silence. There was an edge of mockery in his voice, a taunt like he was waiting for her to crack. Avery met his eyes through the mirror, her expression unchanged, unshaken. "Should I be?" Matthews chuckled, shaking his head. "You're either brave or stupid, lady. I've seen a lot of people act tough, but it never lasts long in the holding cell." Avery didn't respond. She just smiled, a slow, almost imperceptible curve of her lips, like she already knew exactly how this was going to end. Avery didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had dealt with men like Matthews more times than she could count, men who wielded power like a weapon, who bent the rules to serve themselves, who walked away from situations like this without consequence. For now, she let him believe he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last. The Savannah Police Department was quiet when they arrived. The night shift officers lounged behind their desks, sipping lukewarm coffee, engaged in low conversations. The air smelled like stale paperwork and burnt caffeine, the hum of an ancient fluorescent light buzzing overhead. Matthews and Dawson led Avery inside, their boots echoing against the scuffed linoleum floors. The walls were peeling, the station exuding an air of worn-out authority. "Got ourselves a big one tonight," Matthews announced, his voice loud, bracketed. A few officers glanced up, their interest piqued. Dawson stepped forward, tossing the bag of powder onto the counter with a dramatic flourish, like he was revealing a winning lottery ticket. Caught her red-handed, Dawson added, smug. The desk officer, younger man with tired eyes, his name tag reading Keller, hesitated. His gaze flickered to Avery, his brow creasing slightly, as if something about this didn't sit right. "Name?" Keller asked, his tone almost apologetic. "Avery Carter," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Avery paused for the briefest moment. "Calculating consultant," she said finally, vague enough to pass scrutiny, true enough to avoid outright deception. Keller nodded, continuing to type, though his hesitation lingered. He wasn't sure why, but something about this didn't feel like the open and shut case Matthews and Dawson were making it out to be. Matthews, however, had no such doubt. "Don't waste your time, Keller," he smirked. "Paperwork's just a formality." "She won't be staying long." Avery let the words hang in the air. She smiled, just slightly, not because he was right, because she knew something he didn't. Avery remained silent, watching as Keller's fingers hovered over the keyboard. He was hesitating, thinking. That was good. Dawson, on the other hand, had no such doubts. He leaned in, his voice dripping with mock satisfaction. "Hope you enjoy your stay, lady. Won't be long before you're begging for a deal." Avery tilted her head slightly, her tone measured, unwavering. "Maybe," she said, then paused. "Let it breathe. Or maybe they'll see through yours." The subtle threat hung in the air, quiet but sharp enough that Matthews shifted slightly, his confidence cracking for just a second. He muttered something under his breath and stalked away, leaving her alone in the dimly lit holding cell. Avery leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. She knew what came next. Her next moves had to be precise, calculated. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was about to burn something much bigger to the ground. At the processing desk, Keller hesitated, his fingers still resting on the keyboard. The unwritten rules of the station were clear. You don't question senior officers. But this didn't feel right. The stop, the way she carried herself, the too perfect evidence. It felt scripted, staged. Keller's eyes flicked toward the surveillance monitors mounted above his desk. One of the screens showed the hallway outside her cell. Avery sat motionless, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Not angry, not panicked, just waiting, like she already knew the next move. The metal door creaked open as Dawson reappeared, clipboard in hand. His usual smirk was firmly in place. "Morning, sunshine," he drawled, his tone mocked cheerful. "You sleep okay, or was the cot not fancy enough for you?" Avery lifted her gaze, locking eyes with him. She didn't blink, didn't react. She just watched him. And in that moment, Dawson for the first time felt something that almost resembled uncertainty. Doubt takes root. Avery's silence unsettled Dawson more than he wanted to admit. He shifted slightly, glancing down at his clipboard, feigning indifference. "You've got a bail hearing this afternoon," he said, tapping the paper with his pen. "But between you and me, I wouldn't get my hopes up." The way he said it, too casual, too assured, made Keller's unease worsen. It wasn't just the arrest. It wasn't just the way she carried herself. It was the bag of drugs sitting right there in the trunk, like a gift-wrapped package, too easy, too clean. Keller hesitated again, scrolling through the digital records. He read the incident report, the words forming a puzzle in his mind. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection, his brow furrowed. Driver exhibited nervous behavior during questioning. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in the trunk. Pause. Something wasn't right. The wording followed procedure perfectly on the surface. It was textbook. But Keller had been trained to recognize deception, to spot the gaps in a story, and this one, it felt too perfect, too scripted. The seed had been planted. Across town, in the heart of Savannah, a plain black sedan rolled to a smooth stop outside a nondescript office building. The street was quiet, the building itself unremarkable, but inside, it was anything but. The rear door of the sedan swung open. A man stepped out, tailored suit, sharp gaze, controlled presence. Every movement he made was deliberate, calculated. He was flanked by two other agents, their posture alert, professional. The man adjusted his cufflinks and exhaled slowly, scanning the dimly lit street before heading inside. Something had just landed on his desk, and it was about to send shockwaves through Savannah PD ETA on extraction. The question came as the team entered the secure building, their movements swift but controlled. The man in the tailored suit didn't break stride as he checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed when she gives the signal. For now, we watch." Inside the operations center, the tension was palpable. Screens flickered with live surveillance feeds. Maps displayed strategic overlays of the police station's layout, and agents monitored the unfolding situation in real time. The pieces were moving. Now it was just a matter of timing. Pressure mounts. At the station, the air had shifted. Subtly, Avery could feel it, the tightening of control, the weight of unseen eyes. She knew her team was watching, waiting, for the perfect moment, for her signal. A fracture in the system. Keller's footsteps echoed down the hall. Slower this time. Then he stopped, right outside her cell. He hesitated, his expression conflicted, the weight of an unspoken question hanging between them. "You said they're counting on people like me," he said quietly. "What did you mean by that?" Avery's gaze locked onto his, steady, intentional. "You know exactly what I mean." And she saw it, the doubt forming before he could even voice it. That was what they were counting on, his silence, his inaction. Her voice was calm, deliberate, designed to hit the nerve she knew existed, and maybe she was right. The hours dragged on, and Keller's uncertainty shifted into quiet resolve. He needed answers. But he couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. His reputation as a rookie already made him a target for teasing. Scrutiny, any sign of questioning the system could isolate him further. He waited, until Matthews and Dawson left the room. Then he made his move, slipping into the records office. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He started pulling up case files, reports, inconsistencies. And he found them. Attention. Keller stopped, turned, faced her. And for the first time, he was the one with the questions. "Officer Keller." Her voice was soft but commanding, a tone that demanded attention without needing to be loud. Keller hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the wall, as if grounding himself. "What?" he asked, his voice low, almost defensive. Avery watched him, her expression carefully unreadable. "You've seen something, haven't you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Something that doesn't add up." Keller's throat tightened. He swallowed hard. "I can't." He stopped, his voice catching. "I'm just trying to do my job." Avery's gaze didn't waver. "And what is your job, exactly?" The question lingered in the silence, heavy, sharp. She wasn't telling him what to think. She was making him realize he already knew the answer. That night, Keller sat alone at his desk, the glow of the screen illuminating his face. His hands hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding. This was the moment. He could pretend he hadn't seen anything. Let it go. Look the other way. Or he could do what he knew was right. Finally, with a deep breath, he made his decision. His fingers moved. He opened a secure channel, one he wasn't even sure, still worked. One meant for whistleblowers, 4 officers who found themselves standing at the edge of a line they couldn't cross alone. Then, he began typing. He didn't know who would receive the message. Didn't even know if they'd care. But it was the first step toward something that couldn't be undone. And somewhere deep down he already knew it was too late to turn back. In the break room, Matthews leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup resting lazily on his knee. "You notice Keller acting weird today?" he asked, glancing at Dawson. Dawson shrugged, barely looking up from his phone. "Kid's always weird. What's he gonna do, rat us out?" Matthews smirked, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Something felt off. Still, he took a slow sip of coffee. "Keep an eye on him. Last thing we need is some rookie poking his nose where it doesn't belong." And then, at the front of the station, the air shifted. The door swung open, and a team of federal agents entered. Agent Ethan Price led the team, his sharp gaze scanning the room with quiet authority. The moment Keller saw him, his fingers froze mid-typing. His heart pounded for relief. Maybe both. Price approached his desk, leaning in just enough that the surrounding officers wouldn't hear. The desk sergeant, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, instinctively straightened up, his hands shifting toward the radio on his shoulder. "What's this about?" the sergeant asked, his voice wary. Price's reply was calm, direct. "Federal investigation." Behind him, another agent rolled in a cart, stacked with portable servers and external hard drives. Without hesitation, the tech team plugged into the station's network, bypassing security firewalls with practiced ease. Files began scrolling across the monitors, lines of code illuminating the digital archives. Price leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. "Anything?" he asked. A younger agent, sharp-eyed and methodical, tapped the screen. "Plenty," she said, scanning the data. "Their case files are riddled with inconsistencies, arrests, identical narratives, gaps in procedure. This station has a pattern." Price's jaw tightened. "Then let's make sure it ends tonight." Inside the interrogation room, Matthews sat across from his lawyer. His usual cocky arrogance now replaced with quiet desperation. Dawson paced near the wall, his movements jittery, nervous. "This is bad," he muttered, his voice shaking. "They've got everything: audio, video." Matthews exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "There's nothing to know," he snapped. "Everything we did was by the book." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore, because outside this room, just beyond the steel-reinforced door, everything they built was crumbling. Price smirked, tapping the stack of photos before sliding them across the table. Images from the station's own security cameras. Matthews and Dawson, holding the unmarked bag. Before Avery's car was even searched, Matthews stiffened, his fingers curling into fists. His composure cracked, just for a second. "That doesn't prove anything," he snapped. "We were securing evidence." Price raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Really? Because these timestamps say otherwise. And we have audio recordings. Courtesy of Miss Carter's hidden surveillance device capturing every word of your little conversation." Dawson swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had felt in control for so long. Now everything was slipping. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Price studied him. Then, with a cold certainty, he answered, "Now, we clean house." Avery stood near the station's entrance. Her arms crossed as she watched the once smug officers being led out in handcuffs. Matthew's jaw was tight, his expression locked in a mix of anger and disbelief. Dawson looked worse, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, a man who realized too late that the game was over. As they were escorted past their fellow officers, whispers rippled through the room. Some stared. Some pretended not to see. And then there was Keller. He stood near his desk, silent, his expression unreadable. Avery walked past him, their eyes meeting briefly. Keller opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. She paused, turned to face him fully, waiting. "Thank you," Avery said quietly, her voice carrying an unspoken understanding. Keller's chest tightened. For the first time since joining the force, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He gave a small nod, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare him. Weeks later, Avery sat on a park bench, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands. The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the vibrant leaves, painting the ground in shades of gold and amber, a reminder of change. Her mission was complete. But the weight of it still lingered. A familiar presence joined her. Agent Ethan Price. He sat down beside her, his tone dry, amused. You could have handled this differently. Avery smirked. Probably. Price chuckled, shaking his head. You enjoy making enemies. Avery shrugged, taking a slow sip of her coffee. Not really, but I enjoy results. Price laughed. He had expected as much. In a sterile, windowless interrogation room at a federal detention center, Matthews and Dawson sat across from their lawyers, their arrogance gone, replaced with something raw, something desperate. The evidence against them was overwhelming falsified reports. Planted evidence, abuse of authority spanning dozens of cases. Dawson's hands trembled as he muttered under his breath. This is bad, he whispered, his voice barely steady. They've got everything: audio, video, paper trails. Matthews said nothing, because for the first time, there was nothing left to say. Back at the station, Keller felt the weight of mixed reactions from his colleagues. Some supported him, others turned their backs, but Keller stood his ground. He had made his choice, and no matter the fallout, he didn't regret it. Moving forward, Keller didn't care. He had done what was right, and that was enough. A week after her release, Avery met Keller in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. Keller sat across from her, fidgeting with his coffee cup, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I wasn't sure you'd show up, he admitted, his voice low, uncertain. Avery raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on her lips. You earned this conversation, she said simply. Not many people in your position would have done what you did. Keller exhaled, looking away for a second. But there was relief in his posture. Across the city, reforms were already in motion. Convictions overturned, innocent people exonerated, community leaders rallying for deeper change. And it had all started with one choice. In a quiet moment, Avery sat in her sparsely furnished apartment, methodically packing a small bag. A dossier lay open on the table, details of her next assignment. She skimmed the first page, then closed it. Her mind was already focused on the road ahead. Then, her phone buzzed. She picked it up. Agent Price's voice came through the line. You ready? Avery smiled. Always.